Good morning. Today is March 31st. Just fix my camera a little bit there. Okay, today is March 31st. It is currently 11:30 a.m. and today we are going to be focusing on chapter 14 of To Kill a Mockingbird. So I noticed no one's here yet, so I'll just kind of talk to myself and people who are watching this later on. You can see all the information you need about chapter 14. So chapter 14, this chapter's big question is whether or not what you do reflects on your family, and to what extent the actions of our relatives should impact us as individuals. So this chapter deals a lot more with racism. In this chapter, though, it goes more into deeply seated racist beliefs rather than beliefs people say, just kind of beliefs people have, and they don't typically articulate them, just things that are taken for granted almost. Kind of like a bizarre common sense almost type situation. So in this chapter, we find out that the townspeople are talking about Atticus and the Finches, so Scout and Jem, like the whole family unit, in a very negative way. The kids hear a lot of comments while they're walking through town. No one directly tells them anything negative about their family, but people are speaking about them. And whenever they go into an area, whenever they turn to look at who's talking, the people always get quiet. So the adults aren't openly insulting the children, which I guess is better than the alternative, but they're still talking within earshot of two younger kids about how their family's kind of a disappointment, and how negative they think it is that Atticus is supporting an African American man. Now you can contrast this with what we talked about last chapter. Last chapter we talked about Aunt Alexandria and how she thought the family name was of extreme importance and how Atticus was going to damage that. So what she said is actually pretty true, right? So because Atticus is defending Tom Robinson, his family's name's esteem has gone down quite a bit. Now, judging it from today's standards, obviously, like we say, he's still absolutely right for what he's doing, and the people who are viewing him negatively are the ones who are wrong. So the people who are talking about how it's wrong for him to be defending African American, those people are the ones who are in the wrong because they're being racist. But in the context of that time period, if you're really one of the only people openly defying segregation and the racism of the time, it's a very lonely spot for Atticus to be. So the fact that his sister doesn't even really support him and kind of thinks that he should probably just let this go for the sake of his family and for his sake as well, it kind of shows the difference in philosophies and what a strong character Atticus is supposed to be. So another important things in this chapter, we have conflicts between Aunt Alexandria and Scout. In a couple chapters previous, Scout had grown closer to Calpurnia, who, if you remember in the beginning of the story, Scout and Calpurnia really didn't get along. Scout thought Calpurnia was too strict and kind of just mean, and that she went out of her way to target Scout, which we found out is not the case at all, that Calpurnia actually cares about Scout quite a bit. But in this chapter, Scout pretty early on asks Atticus if she can visit Calpurnia, meaning she wants to go to her house, play with her kids, and just kind of interact, like a social visit. Aunt Alexandria interrupts Atticus before he can answer one way or the other, and just says, no, you can't go there. So Scout kind of disrespectfully yells at her aunt, saying, I wasn't talking to you. Now, we do catch that Scout noticed as she was shouting at her aunt, her father kind of looked at Aunt Alexandria and gave her kind of a weird look, probably insinuating the notion that he didn't like that the aunt overstepped her bounds here, because that he was, in fact, being asked the question. So he probably wanted to answer it himself. We also kind of get the notion, just based on Atticus's behavior up to this point, he probably would have allowed Scout to go there. So he probably is more inclined in this situation to agree with Scout than Aunt Alexandria, but because Scout was so rash and shouted at her aunt and was disrespectful, and remember, of course, that Aunt Alexandria is Atticus's younger sister, Atticus gets upset with Scout instead and forces her to apologize to Aunt Alexandria. So that kind of like takes this question about whether or not Scout's going to visit Calpurnia off the table, because now the kind of the mood's gone down so much, and because now Scout feels shamed in front of her father, she kind of just leaves the room and pretends like she's going to the bathroom just to get out of that situation where she feels embarrassed. While she's gone, she hears Atticus and Aunt Alexandria speaking, and they begin talking about whether or not Calpurnia should be fired. We find out that Aunt Alexandria doesn't want Calpurnia there. We know Alexandria is a very good cook. We know she's big into domestics. Like, she likes to clean, she likes to take care of the house. She's kind of like an old-fashioned housewife almost, but still very proper. And she doesn't think Calpurnia is necessary. But also, she kind of hints through conversation that she thinks that being around Calpurnia is damaging Scout in some way. Now, she doesn't go into detail. It's just very quick, but you kind of get that notion that she thinks that Scout's not growing up to be a proper lady. And that was demonstrated in the previous chapter when Scout didn't know a lot about the family. She came into the party dressed in like overalls and was really dirty. And she just doesn't speak proper the way Aunt Alexandria would expect a young lady to behave. So Aunt Alexandria has specific expectations of how a young girl should behave. Scout's not living up to those. And since she can't blame Atticus, she's kind of blaming Calpurnia and the lack of a suitable mother figure. And Alexandria seems like she's willing to step into that role. Now, Atticus refuses to fire Calpurnia. We know that Atticus actually respects Calpurnia just from the way that he's spoken about her in the past. So she is someone who works for him in a serving capacity, but he does hold her in a level of respect. So he thinks that Calpurnia is actually beneficial to Jem and Scout, that she's strict, and that probably allows Atticus to carry on with his kind of hands-off parenting approach. If Calpurnia wasn't there to kind of be like the heavy or the enforcer of the rules, Atticus would most likely have to take on that role himself. So he benefits from having Calpurnia there. And we do see that Atticus is able to enforce the rules, and the children do fear him when he gets angry. Jem was scared about being whipped in an earlier chapter. So it's not like they completely disrespect their father and aren't afraid of him. It's just that Atticus in general has a very hands-off approach. And if Calpurnia wasn't there, that probably wouldn't work as well. So Atticus refuses to fire Calpurnia and basically just tells Aunt Alexandria that that's the end of the conversation and they're not going to discuss it any farther. Now, we've seen some growth here in Atticus because the last chapter, Atticus kind of got bullied around a little bit by his sister. If you remember last chapter, she convinced him to go talk to his children about how to behave like gentlefolk. It didn't go well, and it ended with Scout crying and Jem confused. So it seems like Atticus has done a complete 180 on this and is back to his normal parenting style. And he fairly overtly and confidently tells Aunt Alexandria that this is just the way some things are going to be in this particular household. So that kind of ends Aunt Alexandria's attempt at altering her brother's parenting style. The next big conflict that takes place in this chapter is Jem and Scout. So if you continued reading through the chapter, when Scout eventually left the living room, she went by her brother. Her brother kind of wanted to talk to her, and he suggested that Scout stop antagonizing their aunt. Now, Scout's very touchy at this point because Jem has already kind of grown distant from Scout, and he doesn't want to interact with her as often as he used to. And this has happened kind of abruptly, primarily because now he's 12 and he thinks he's just too old to be hanging out with his younger sister. So she already is upset that he thinks he's better than her. So when he gives her advice that, hey, you need to stop antagonizing Auntie, she takes that with a great deal of offense. Now, Jem's able to backtrack a little bit and say, hey, I'm really just worried about Atticus. He's under a lot of stress. So it seems like he has a chance, like he understands Scout, and he understands how upset she gets when people tell her what to do. So he has like that effort shown where he's trying to use Atticus almost as a means to get Scout to behave and listen to him. But then he makes a mistake when he threatens to whip her if she doesn't, I think spank is the word he uses, if she doesn't listen to him. And then that just ends the conversation. Scout, being the little terror that she can be, she immediately attacks Jem. Hair's pulled, punches are thrown. Jem is getting the better of it because he's older, and but in her mind, Scout decides that she's winning because one, he's fighting her like an equal. He's not acting adult-like at this point. He's actually fighting. And even though she's losing, just the act of Jem coming to her level shows that they're still equals. And then when Atticus comes in the room because he hears them screaming and hitting each other, he punishes them equally. He tells them both to go to bed. He doesn't even really listen to them for very long. He just kind of asks Scout what was going on. Scout says she doesn't have to mind her older brother too, does she? And Atticus's response is kind of, well, if he can make you, then you have to listen to him. So it kind of like gives Scout this idea that she is still on an equal footing with her brother. So, oh, hi. This is 8th grade English. We are going over to Kill a Mockingbird. We are on chapter 14. So if you're oh, hi Ben, I just saw the name, I didn't notice. So yeah, this is 8th grade material. I'm going to do 7th grade material at 11:30. So we'll go over Anne Frank scenes 2 and 3 at that point. So you're welcome to stay on. You haven't read much of this book, so if you want to listen to it, you can. You're welcome. Okay, so I'm going to go back to recapping this. Hopefully some people come on and listen to this later. The next big functioning in this chapter is the return of Dill. So when Scout goes back to her room, she finds something's under her bed. She kind of panics. She runs to Jem instead of Atticus, which shows that their relationship is still fine. So she goes and gets Jem. She tries to convince him to come, like, see if there's a snake under there. Initially, there's a little bit of a back and forth where Jem says, well, he's not putting his face next to a snake. But eventually he does come with like a broom, and he's going to just kind of sweep and see if a snake's under there. It turns out it's not a snake at all. It's actually Dill. And Dill has run away from his new family, or his new father, and has made his way to Macomb. And he was hiding under Scout's bed. So they immediately ask him what he was doing. And he explains this long story. Remember that Dill's very imaginative. He says that his new father was incredibly cruel. He chained him in the basement and was going to just let him starve to death. Luckily for Dill, a farmer was passing by who had peas, and he slid some peas through the bars of the windows, and Dill was able to eat on that until he was able to wriggle free from the chains and then make his escape, running all the way back to Macomb. Now this is a lie, but it seems to suffice at the moment for Jem and Scout. Although later on we know that Scout doesn't really buy his story. She asks him what really happened, and Jem, being older, also probably doesn't believe what he's saying. But knowing that Dill's very imaginative, they kind of let that go. Now Dill does later on explain the reason why he ran away is that his parents just weren't showing interest in him. Now, since his mother just remarried, they're newlyweds, so obviously they want to spend a lot of time together. Dill, being kind of young at this point, I think at this point he's 9 or 10, he notices that they buy him a lot of things like books and toys, but they don't want to play with him. So he takes offense to this. Dill's always kind of been an odd child. He's very curious. He's very innocent. He's very creative. But he also, we've picked up the notion that he's very social, right? As soon as he came to Macomb, he immediately introduced himself to 2 other children, and he tried to impress them with his ability to read, and then later on he impressed them with his ability to recall movie events. So they put on all those little plays. But he's very awkward and he's lonely, and he's naive. So the fact that his parents don't want to spend time with him, that definitely damages his psyche. And then we also know from earlier conversations, especially during the Christmas scene where Francis kind of parroted a lot of the things that Aunt Alexandra had said about Dill. We know that Dill gets passed around from family member to family member. So he spends time with his Aunt Stephanie in the summers typically, and he gets kind of passed around from relative to relative. So the fact that the time that he finally thinks he's going to have a real family, his mom and his new father are going to spend all this time with him, when that doesn't happen, that kind of hurts him psychologically, and he runs away. So he runs away to Macomb, and a line he says at the very end of the chapter, where he's kind of relating to Boo Radley, and Scout says, well, why do you think Boo never ran away? And he says, well, maybe he doesn't have anywhere to run to. So it's kind of like Dill thinks of Macomb as his home. So even though Scout and Jem aren't his brothers and sisters, and even though Atticus isn't his father, he still views the town almost as kind of being his home. So that's where he went for safety and security, right? So that's where he goes. So if anything, that's a compliment to Atticus and Scout and Jem and how well they treat Dill and how accepted he feels when he's here. Another issue that comes away from this, a pretty big one, is the fact that Jem tells Atticus that Dill is actually hiding in the house. Scout assumes that she and Dill can kind of keep this a secret for a while, get some food to Dill, and kind of like just keep him there as a secret. Jem, however, runs off and tells Atticus. So, and he does it within earshot of the other children. So this is like breaking a social code almost, like he's telling on Dill. Now, Jem sees that this is being okay because he's older than them. He's more adult-like. He's starting to view himself on a closer footing to the adult. So he thinks he's closer to Atticus than he is to his sister. But the fact that he tells on them, Scout views this as treachery. And she thinks he's broken kind of a social code. She also does mention that she had a conversation with Dill about whether or not they should remain civil towards Atticus, because they're both clearly offended by it, even though everything kind of turns out well. But that brings up another interesting issue, and that's Atticus's reaction to the whole situation. So Atticus comes, finds this young boy hiding under his in his daughter's room, who had been hiding under her bed. He's filthy. He's clearly hungry. Atticus doesn't yell at him at all. He doesn't really even question him as to why he's there. Kind of get the notion from Atticus that he kind of understands Dill a little bit. So he doesn't know all the details, but he kind of understands that Dill feels comfortable here. And he already knew Dill wasn't supposed to come this summer because of his new father and how the mother wanted to keep him in like a family unit. But he probably kind of reads between the lines here and realizes that Dill's upset about something. So instead of yelling at him, instead of like scolding him for running away, he offers to go speak to Stephanie Crawford, Dill's aunt, ease the situation and see if it's okay for Dill to stay the night there. So kind of giving him a safe place to stay. Stephanie Crawford does eventually come over. She kind of berates Dill for scaring his mother, scaring everybody, like what was he thinking? But then that ends with Stephanie Crawford giving him a hug. So they do still have that like positive aunt-nephew relationship. And she agrees to let him spend the night with Atticus. Presumably, Stephanie's going to go call Dill's mother and let her know what's going on. Atticus' reaction shows a few things. One, it shows trust in his children. Two, it shows a lot of compassion that he, instead of just marching Dill over to his aunt's, he kind of wants to give him a safe place. He's not sure exactly why he ran away at this point, but he wants to give the kid who's clearly in distress a safe place. He also makes a joke about all of the dirt in the county being on Dill, and that's going to lead to more erosion. So it's kind of like a bad dad joke, and Atticus has done that a few times, just told like a really bad joke that no one understands. This time Scout knows he's trying to tell a joke, but she doesn't seem like she understands the gist of the joke. They do get Dill some food. They do let him spend the night. He's supposed to spend the night in Jem's room, but he sneaks off in Scout's room. And again, they're still really young, like 8, 9. So like nothing happens. It's not a romantic thing. It's just friends. But while they're laying together, that's when Dill has the conversation about why he really did run away. So he does confide in Scout his feelings of loneliness, not being accepted. And he kind of really reveals himself as being very childlike, even though he's older than Scout by I think 2 years. Scout's much more mature than he is when it comes to just kind of understanding social conventions and just imaginative in general. Dill talks about how babies come from some island, but he's sure that's not why they really come from people, but he also thinks this island's a thing too. And then he goes into that conversation with Boo, where it seems like he's starting to relate to Boo. In the beginning, Boo was kind of like a boogeyman, and he hasn't shown up in the story much lately as a focus of the children's attention, but he's still kind of mentioned every now and again. And now it looks like Dill, rather than just seeing him as a monster or a curiosity, it seems like he's more relating to him, kind of like both of them are unwanted. And Boo, his parents kind of broke him as a person because they didn't really respect him. And Dill sees his mother's lack of interest in him being kind of her pushing him away, like she doesn't really want him. So Dill's kind of sad and lonely at this point, and he's getting that companionship from Scout and Jem and being accepted by Atticus. So it's kind of a sad chapter, this one. It shows us a lot about the relationships in the family, though. It shows that Jem and Scout will fight a lot. It shows that they don't resent each other afterwards. After their fight, they both said goodnight to each other. When she needed help, because she thought there was a snake, she immediately ran to her brother. So she doesn't resent him. Even after he tells on Dill for having snuck into the house, she still is willing to speak to him, and she's not going to hold that grudge against him, even though they're kind of drifting apart due to age. It also shows the relationship that Dill and Scout have, like their relationships. She's almost like his safe spot. So he needed somewhere to go, needed somewhere to be accepted, and running to their house was where he goes. So she and Jem are kind of like his security almost. It also shows more into Atticus's parenting style, how his code of conduct and his empathy kind of extends to everybody. So Dill's not his son. He knows who he is, but he could easily have just walked him over to Stephanie Crawford's house and let her deal with him, because this wasn't his problem. He already has a lot on his plate. He's dealing with the trial. Aunt Alexandria is staying there, and she's getting on his case about like how he's raising his children. So he has stress from her. He has stress from the trial. He has the 2 young children who he's concerned about, whether or not they're hearing all these negative things in town and how that's impacting them. So if anything, Atticus was probably the last person who needed more stress on his life. But when the stress arrives, he is okay with it. He doesn't get upset. He doesn't yell. He doesn't break. He just kind of makes a joke at one point with Aunt Alexandria that they're already dealing with, the trial, and now he also has, a runaway. So it's just kind of, he makes the joke like it's not a big deal, and he just doesn't let this become something bigger than it is. So that shows more about his character. So that kind of wraps up this chapter. I added the quiz for this chapter to the Google Classrooms already, so when you're ready, you can go there and take that quiz. Yesterday, I added another graphic organizer. The graphic organizer is on Atticus's parenting style. So it's kind of a simple graphic organizer. You just list the pros and the cons of Atticus's parenting style. I thought about doing a compare-contrast between Aunt Alexandria and Atticus, but you really have to read between the lines to get Aunt Alexandria's parenting style, so I decided not to do that yet. I might do that later on as an assignment. But for now, what you just do, you go onto the website. There's a graphic organizer that you can edit, and you just list the benefits and the negatives to Atticus's kind of hands-off parenting style. So what are some good things about how he's parenting his children, and what are some possible negative consequences? If you're having trouble finding the negatives, I would suggest remember back to when Aunt Alexandria talks. So, like, what does she say that is wrong with what he's doing? Specifically, like with regards to Scout. She doesn't normally say much about how he's hurting Jem, but she does say how his parenting style is hurting Scout. Sorry, I needed a drink there. So, yeah, so go to the Google Classrooms when you get a chance to do that. I think there's also some vocabulary on there. I will put the summary of this chapter on there as soon as I end this. I also found a play, a complete play of To Kill a Mockingbird, and I uploaded that onto the site, or rather, I uploaded a link to the YouTube video on Google Classroom. So if you go in Google Classrooms, you'll see a link for the To Kill a Mockingbird play. So it's not the same as the video I showed in class where we showed you guys clips of the old movie, but it's still pretty close. They only show one scene throughout the entire play, so you're always just kind of seeing the outside of their house. And I think towards the end they do shift it a little bit to show you the trial, but they alter the story slightly just to fit the lack of scene changes. And there are a few other minor differences, but for the most part, it's pretty close. It's pretty well done. So watch that if you want. Next chapter, chapter 15, will take us to that clip that we watched the very first day of class. Remember when I showed you guys a clip and I mentioned that this happened in the middle of the play? And that's where Atticus is standing outside of a prison. A mob shows up, and Jem, Scout, and Dill arrive and try to convince the people there to disperse rather than harming Atticus. So next chapter is the chapter where that will take place, and you guys will get to actually see what that means. So we will go over that on Thursday. We'll talk a little bit more about conflicts. We'll talk a little bit more about comparing and contrasting Atticus to the other townspeople and how their views and Atticus's views are so alien towards one another. So that's kind of what we'll go over next time. And that's all for today. So I will see you guys at 10:30 on Thursday. Thanks, and bye.